In the candlelit halls of a Louisiana plantation in 1839, as laughter and wine flowed, a single moment of silence fell, when Eliza, the enslaved servant, drew a blade and slit her master's throat at the dinner table. Louisiana, in the early 19th century, was a land of wealth and spectacle, grand plantation houses rising above endless fields of sugarcane and cotton. To the outside world, these plantations were symbols of prosperity, of Southern refinement. But beneath the chandeliers and carved furniture lay the suffering of thousands of enslaved men and women whose labor built that grandeur. Among them was Eliza. Eliza was young, no more than her early 20s, and her life had been marked by chains from the very beginning. She was a house servant on one of the largest estates in Louisiana. That meant she lived not in the fields but inside the master's house, tasked with cooking, cleaning, and serving at the table. On the surface, it might have seemed like a privileged position. She wore cleaner clothes, slept under a roof, but inside the house her suffering was constant, intimate, and inescapable. Her master was a man of wealth and cruelty. Known among his peers for arrogance, he treated those he enslaved not as people, but as objects of mockery and control. He humiliated them for sport, punished them at the slightest provocation, and used their bodies as he pleased. Eliza endured his gaze, his insults, and his hands. She was forced to smile, to serve him and his guests, even as every day scraped away at her dignity. Louisiana's plantation world was built on imbalance, lavish banquets on one side, endless suffering on the other. Eliza knew it well, and as the years pressed on, her silence grew heavier, until one day she resolved that silence would end. For Eliza, each day was a performance she could not leave. From the moment she rose, she was watched, commanded, and controlled. She scrubbed the silver until it gleamed, dusted furniture she could never own, and poured wine she could never taste. The master's cruelty was relentless. He mocked her in front of guests, slapping her if she moved too slowly. He reminded her often that she was property, that her life belonged to him, and in the shadows of the house he took more than labor from her, forcing himself upon her, treating her body as yet another thing he owned. There were moments of public humiliation designed to break her spirit. Once, when Eliza accidentally spilled a few drops of wine on the polished table, he made her kneel before the guests, berating her as they laughed. Another time, he dragged her by the arm across the dining hall for not bowing quickly enough. Each act left scars, not always visible but deep within her soul. But cruelty breeds resistance, and in Eliza the flame of resistance grew stronger each day. By the autumn of 1839, the plantation was preparing for one of its grandest dinners. The master had invited the neighboring planters, their wives, and even a local politician to his table. It was to be a night of indulgence. Roast meats, fine wine imported from France, music played on a grand piano. The halls were lit with candles, the silver polished until it dazzled, and the finest tablecloth, white as snow, was laid out for the feast. For Eliza, it was another night of servitude. She polished the glasses, arranged the platters, and carried the weight of her master's cruelty in silence. But inside, she carried something else, a small blade, hidden away, pressed close to her body. How she acquired it, no one can say. Perhaps it was a knife slipped from the kitchen. Perhaps it was smuggled by another servant who knew her suffering. What matters is that Eliza carried it with her that night, a secret heavier than chains. As she moved through the house, preparing dishes, arranging candles, she rehearsed her decision again and again. The risk was unthinkable. If she failed, the punishment would be a death more brutal than imagination could hold. But if she succeeded, her master's cruelty would end forever. Each step, each glance, each command brought her closer to the breaking point. The night of the dinner arrived. The grand hall glowed with candlelight, shadows dancing against the high ceilings. The long table was adorned with polished silver, crystal glasses, and platters of steaming food. Laughter rang out as the guests settled in, their voices full of pride, their words dripping with arrogance. Wine flowed, glasses clinked, and music drifted from the piano in the corner. At the head of the table sat the master, his voice booming above the rest. He bragged of his wealth, of his slaves, mocking them as if they were nothing more than animals. He laughed at their pain, turning suffering into entertainment for his guests. Eliza moved silently around the table, refilling glasses, setting down dishes, bowing when spoken to. Her hand brushed the hidden blade with each movement, her heart pounding in her chest. The master raised his glass high, boasting of his power, his control, and in that moment, something in Eliza broke. She stepped forward. Her hand trembled, not from fear, but from the surge of rage and resolve that had built inside her for years. As she leaned close to pour his wine, her fingers closed around the blade, and in a single motion, she drew it across his throat. The sound was swift, sickening, the sharp slice of steel against flesh. His words choked into silence. The glass fell from his hand and shattered on the floor. For a heartbeat, the room was frozen. The guests stared, mouths open, unable to comprehend what they had just seen. Then the screams began. The master clutched his throat, blood spilling across the white tablecloth, staining it crimson. He gurgled, eyes wide with shock as his life poured out before the horrified faces of his peers. The laughter that had filled the hall turned to chaos. Chairs scraping, women shrieking, men shouting. The piano fell silent. Only the sound of panic, of gasps and sobs, filled the air. And there stood Eliza, her chest heaving, her hand still clutching the blade. For the first time she looked down at her master not as property, not as servant, but as his equal, and as his end. What happened in the minutes that followed is lost to silence, but the aftermath was inevitable. Eliza was seized, beaten, and dragged away. For an enslaved woman to kill her master in front of witnesses was an act the plantation elite could not tolerate. Her fate was sealed the moment she struck. Some accounts suggest she was executed swiftly, hanged before the eyes of the community. Others whisper she was tortured first, made into an example so no other enslaved person would dare to follow her path. However it happened, Eliza's body was destroyed, but her act could not be erased. News of the dinner spread across Louisiana. Among the planter class, there was panic. If a servant within their own household could rise against them at their own tables, what safety remained? Fear of rebellion, already simmering, flared once more. Among the enslaved, Eliza's name passed in whispers. Her courage, her final act of defiance, became legend. She had done what many dreamed of, but few dared. Striking back at the very man who had tormented her. She had seized one moment, one blade, and used it to shatter the illusion of her master's invincibility. Her story, like so many others, was quickly buried by history. Planters had no desire to preserve the memory of an enslaved woman's resistance. They wrote their ledgers, their letters, their histories, and in them Eliza's name was erased. But memory has a way of surviving in silence. Eliza's act was more than violence, it was resistance. It was humanity asserting itself in a world that denied her any. She refused to remain silent, refused to let cruelty go unanswered, and though she paid with her life, her story echoes even now, nearly 2 centuries later. Eliza's story is not just one of violence, but of resistance against a world built on cruelty. This was her final act of defiance, but countless other stories remain untold. If you want to hear more hidden slave stories that history tried to erase, watch this playlist here, and don't forget to subscribe. Some stories cannot be erased. Some voices will always return.